This Lent, we've been learning more about prayer and being able to recognize God in the midst of all the events, the thoughts, the feelings that go on in our lives every day. Last week, we considered examples of how God wants to help strengthen us along that path of following Him, giving us experiences of what are called spiritual consolations. And following St. Ignatius, I try to give examples of what these uplifting experiences can be like, so that we can recognize when they come from God. And I know that for some of you, some of those examples resonated with maybe experiences that you've had yourself. Though maybe for others, you might not have been as sure as to what I was talking about for some of that. The consolations that God gives will be unique to each one of us, especially since we're all in different places in this relationship with the Lord. But He doesn't exclude anybody from these kinds of experiences. So we want to make sure we ask ourselves, have I given Him opportunity to give them to me? Have I spent time in silence and prayer? Of course, no one experiences those kinds of uplifting consolations from God all the time. He just doesn't give them to us in that way. Much of the time, life is just simply the ordinary things that go on, filled with regular pleasure or pain, joy or sorrow, energy, fatigue. It's all normal to our human lives. And there's times when God's going to break in with His consolations. We can really notice that He's there. But then there's also other times which we experience the opposite of His consolation. And St. Ignatius calls it spiritual desolation. Spiritual desolation. It's an experience of a kind of like dryness or heaviness of heart, feeling discouraged or disheartened when it comes to our relationship with God. Prayer feels empty and dry. Inside, we're agitated, maybe more susceptible to temptations. Maybe we feel without hope, without love. We feel kind of lazy and tepid and sad about trying to follow God. And it's an experience as though God's not there. So if we give an example of what this might look like, our first reading, we go to that. The Israelites have just been freed from the Egyptians. They were in slavery there for over 400 years. And they have just been freed. And so they just experienced all these wonderful works that God did, all the plagues and the crossing of the Red Sea, the destruction of their enemies. They experienced God's great power and care for them. It really would have been like this time of consolation, knowing God is with them. But now, after they cross the sea, they're faced with the expanse of the desert in front of them. And they begin to travel through it, the harsh winds, the blowing sands, the beating sun upon them. Food and water is scarce. And they just have to walk and walk and walk. And we can certainly imagine a kind of heaviness growing upon them, a kind of discouragement, hopelessness, maybe even a kind of depression. And they began to complain in our reading today. Why did we ever leave Egypt? What did we do that for? We had at least food there, at least food and water. Does God really care about us? Did He just bring us out here to die of thirst? Maybe you can think of moments in your life like that where you've thought, well, maybe God's not here. Maybe He doesn't really care about me. Or He's not as real as our faith claims to be. Things have just bogged us down so much that it's really hard to pray. It's difficult to go to church. Everything is just blah. Well, that's an experience of spiritual desolation. And we all go through that. There's nothing wrong when we have that kind of experience. We all go through times of discouragement, dryness in prayer. But it's important to know that God gives us spiritual consolation, but He allows us to go through desolation. He's not the one giving it to us. He allows us, and we'll consider why he allows another day. But for today, it's important that we know that consolation always comes from God. But that desolation that we go through, that never comes from him. He simply only allows it. But that's often sometimes our mistake. Well, I guess these things are just happening in my life, and I guess God just wants me to be miserable. Well, that's a lie. It's a big lie from the evil one. We should reject that. It's not true. We want to reject what's bad and accept what's good. So when we're feeling desolation, like separated from God, we want to reject it. And the way that we do that is by turning back to him in prayer. So maybe you're experiencing a time in which prayer doesn't seem to be doing anything at all, and temptation is really just to stop. But instead, we persevere. Jesus, doesn't feel like anything's happening. I don't know if you're there, but I know that I'm supposed to keep going. So just help me to do that. Help me to remain faithful. When we're in spiritual desolation, we feel as if we're separated from God. And that's important to say, as if. We feel as if we're separated from God. Because the truth is, we're not separated from him. He's still there. God's always there. Consider again the Israelites in the desert. God's left us here by ourselves to die in the desert. They think they're all alone. But Moses knows better. He resists what's going on. And he calls out to God, God, your people are so frustrated now. They're thirsty. What are we to do? And so, of course, God is still there. He's always there. And he answers the prayer. And he provides the water they need. But don't we often do that when we're discouraged, when that sadness sets in, and we just try to pull ourselves up all on our own? A lot of times it doesn't work. Instead of rather turning to God in those moments in prayer. We can also use the example in our gospel of the Samaritan woman to help us understand about spiritual desolation. We know just a little bit from this passage about her background. We know that she'd been married 5 times. She had 5 husbands. And we don't know all the details of that, but we can imagine the kind of things that led up to that. Divorce after divorce. The failure in her first marriage would have definitely put her in a state of desolation. Wouldn't have been a joyful thing for her to go through. And that made her susceptible to going into those other unhealthy relationships, searching for love and happiness in all the wrong ways, with all the wrong men, to a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth, and now living with someone that she's not married to at all. Because of this, she's been shunned by her community, which is why it says in the passage she's there at the well in the middle of the day, the hottest part of the day, when nobody would go, so she can avoid the judgmental looks of her neighbors. And her situation teaches us one thing that St. Ignatius says that we should do when we're feeling desolation. When we're in desolation, we should never make a change. We should never make a change. When we're in desolation, it's the evil one who tries to give us advice and to get us off track of following God. So for this woman, it was the decision to change from one relationship to another, searching desperately to try to find love, but failing again and again. You see, when she's in desolation, it wasn't God giving her that advice. It was the evil one throwing her off. So when we're in desolation, never make a change. Maybe somebody's, usually prays before they go to bed, but work has been just, nothing went right today. And we're just so tired. The temptation is to, well, maybe I won't pray tonight. Instead, there's the temptation, the computer over in the corner. One click leads to 30, and suddenly he goes down a path in which he wishes he never had gone. But it started when he made that change not to pray, when he was feeling that desolation. Maybe last month when things were going so well that we said, sure, I'll help out with that thing in the parish. And now things aren't quite as good and I don't really feel God's closeness. And I'm like, well, maybe I'll just call up and say, I can't really do that anymore. We're thinking of making a change when we feel so far away from God. Maybe I made a resolution to make sure I get to confession this month. But I've been struggling so much this week, and, I just keep doing the same sin over and over again. It's really not going to make a difference, and so maybe I shouldn't go. Well, when we're feeling separated from God like that, we can't make good decisions. It's only when we're close to Him that we can really make those good decisions. So we want to stick with our commitments that we had when we felt close to God. Like in the instance of this woman, it would do so much in relationships. It could probably save marriages, knowing that kind of rule. That when you're in desolation, never make a change. So Jesus comes into the Samaritan woman's life in this time of desolation to draw her out. He shows her what she's really thirsting for. In the midst of their thirst in the desert, God comes in and He draws them out, brings them to the water that they need. The same way, Jesus comes to us in the times when we experience desolation, feeling far from Him. He draws us out. We all go through these times of desolation when we feel as if we're separated from God. But since this desolation does not come from Him, we should never make changes based upon that desolation, but instead resist it by turning back to Him in prayer.